This is my house. Me and my husband bought it 8 years ago. I haven't lived here for nearly 7 months. I lived here. An A&E visit that turned into a 6-week hospital stay. Turned into a 6-month hospital stay. I call my husband.
Hey, it's me. Yeah, I'm just back at the house because I just... No, everything's fine. She's okay.
He thinks something's happened to her. Every unscheduled phone call from me plunges him into panic. And I can sense the fear in his voice.
Just thought I'd come back and get some fresh clothes and pick up Fredbear because she's been going on about Fredbear all week, and I just thought I'd just come back and get it. So, well, no, she had a 2-hour session booked in with a play therapist, so I just thought, well, she's not on her own, is she? She's been in there for like over 7 months. She sees her every week. She knows who she is.
But I'm scared too. I'm hurt. I'm hurt that it's always about her. I'm ashamed that I feel that way. That I'm selfish and that I don't exist. But I can't tell him that. So I defend my decision to visit what was once my home.
Yeah, well, you don't always bring all the right stuff, do you? I've been wearing the same goddamn hoodie for 3 weeks.
To touch the things that were once my belongings. To live the life that I once lived. And to feel like myself.
She'll be fine.
I want him to say it's okay, that leaving our sick daughter even for an hour is okay. But he doesn't. I hate myself for leaving her there. I can't tell him that. So I deflect the conversation.
So what's going on in the living room anyway? All the wallpaper's been stripped off. There's gaping holes everywhere. What are you doing? Oh, right. So it's going to be like that for another year, is it? Yeah.
And in fairness to me, the living room does look like a crack den.
You've been letting the dog on the bed?
Having the dog on the bed really isn't hygienic.
Yeah. Well, and the fridge is full of junk.
Eating crap really won't make you feel better. But none of that really matters.
Right. Okay. Sure. Yeah. All right. Fine. Speak to you later. Bye.
We'll go back. Just 10 more minutes.
Hello everybody, I'm Professor Mark Fielder. I'm a microbiologist who works in the area of One Health and especially in relation to antimicrobial resistance. So what I'm interested in is how antibiotic resistance impacts on other people, how it impacts on other animals, and how it impacts on our lives. And that's really critical, I think. When we think about antibiotic resistance, most of the time we think about an organism that we can't treat. But on the other end of that, there is a patient. Whether that patient's got 4 legs or 2 legs, that patient is at the mercy of the organism that we either can't treat or have difficulty treating. And I think one thing, if we think about the video that we've seen recently, the me and her video, that really emphasizes the discordancy that antimicrobial resistance can cause when somebody's in hospital on a long-term basis and they have issues which mean the family is split up, which means that they are potentially facing a really uncertain future. And all the problems and concomitant issues that come together that make a nasty situation medically become a socially difficult situation. And I think that video brought out a number of different aspects, including the relationship between the mother and the father, the relationship between the child and the parents, the difficulties with the parents and the child being split up, the nervousness, the panic, the uncertainty, and also, interestingly and importantly, the role of animals in the whole dynamic of what was going on, because there was a clear message there about the family pet. And I don't want to hog the time talking about that, because I think I've got very good colleagues here with Dr. Elaine Cloutman-Green and Professor Nicola Williams, who can bring in both the clinical and the veterinary aspects of that much better than I can. Is there anything you folks would like to add or augment about what I've already said in relation to that video? How about you, Nicola? You go, you're on the brink of saying something.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that video really brought home sort of the human cost that we don't always tend to see, especially when we're researching AMR. So I'm a bit similar to what you do, Mark, in terms of I'm interested in antimicrobial resistance from a One Health point of view. I look more at the animal end, and then that interface with people, whether it's through contact with animals or through food or through the environment. So a lot of the time we're a bit more removed from the issue.
Yeah.
And you kind of forget that human cost is sort of invisible a lot of the time, AMR. It's till it's actually causing that problem and, you know, impacting on people's lives, and also animals, because we get animal infections, especially in our hospitals, where animals have untreatable infections with similar organisms to, you know, what we see in people. And then obviously people have that same bond with their animals, with their dogs, as, you know, they do with children as well. So I guess it's sort of making the problem a bit more visible for us, and really getting over that human cost element that sometimes, well, certainly I am sometimes a little bit more detached from.
I think that's a really good point. One of the first times I really got involved properly with a public engagement event around exactly what you're talking about was with a national veterinary practice who asked me to come and talk to them on a video that they were sending out to all their farmers that was backing up what they were saying clinically about how they treat the farm animals, because the farmers often don't see exactly what you're saying. You know, that they have a problem with an animal on a farm or in their, you know, in their household, depending on what the animal is. They don't see necessarily the on situation for that. So I was there talking to them about what happens downstream, what happens in the hospitals, what happens in the clinics, and it might be a manifestation of, or a related situation to the organism that perhaps was on the farm at one stage. And of course, it goes the other way as well. It goes both ways. It's not just a one-way street. So, Elaine, what's your feelings about what we've been talking about?
So I think it's really fascinating to speak with people who aren't based in a hospital about this, because, like, when you talk about farm animals, obviously one of the big resistant issues that we're really interested in is like pan resistance, which means we can't treat patients at all for things like Klebsiella. And we've had some of that come about. But when you look at tracking where that happened, it happened because of the fact that we had humans and animals living in close proximity. And then we felt like we might have had spread through birds. And we talk about this as if it's a new thing, whereas obviously, you know, the 1918 flu pandemic happened because of the fact that we had humans and different types of animals living in really close proximity to each other. So this isn't a new thing. This goes back centuries, and it's so complicated. And I think that the video by Becky did a great job of showing that human impact. And it's even harder because I work in paediatrics. So I work at Great Ormond Street in infection control. If I have to stick a child who's learning to walk, who's learning to talk, into isolation for, you know, sometimes we have patients that will stay for 12 months, they'll stay for longer because they have complicated conditions. That's a long time to lose out on that developmental part of your progress. You know, you may not catch up from that in the same way. And I have a lot of conversations with families about the fact that they bear the burden of this cost in order to protect others. And I suppose that's kind of just societally what we're trying to do at the moment. And it's not always an easy thing to ask of people in order to, you know, people want to put their child first. And sometimes you're asking them to put other people's children's first and for them to bear the brunt as a family. I'm really excited about talking about AMR in animals though, because obviously we have things like, we have dogs that come into the hospital. So we have treatment animals that come in, and I get asked an awful lot of questions about, you know, where can dogs go? What kind of screening do my dogs need to have before they come and visit my patient in an ITU? And so it's really great to be able to speak to people who know a little bit more about that than I do. So I'm very excited to be here.
I've never known you be so excited, Elaine. Well, I think another thing that was really interesting that came out in the video is certainly in relation to human relationships was just how fracturing it was. You can see the angst and the anxiety from both the mother and the father, perhaps augmenting in different ways, but it was definitely there. She's obviously been, as in the way it's portrayed in the video, at the forefront, obviously being the mum next to the child. Of course, that could equally be the father, whilst the other parent, in this case, the father, was out at work. And that minute that something's changed, you know, she's away and phoning from home because she needs a bit of reassurance or downtime, as anybody would. His immediate emotion is, what's happened? Something's gone wrong. And again, that's the other part of AMR that I think when we're in the labs or possibly working in the clinics directly, we perhaps forget is behind. And that happens in both, you know, human and animal situations. I think a patient's potential demise, the patient's potential change in status is going to have a big impact on those around. I mean, how prevalent do we think the spread of antibiotics, or the potential for spread of antibiotic resistance, is from animals to humans, and especially in relation to our pets? I mean, do we think that's an issue that we need to be considering quite carefully?
I mean, there's no doubt that we share, as you know, a lot of bacteria between us and pets. There's been quite a few studies that show things like E. coli, which are commonly found in the gut of many different types of animals and people. You know, you can see the same types of E. coli in the dog that lives in a household and the family. And, you know, we definitely know transmission goes both ways. There's quite a few studies. I guess it's hard, like what Elaine's already said, that about that quantification of what the role is in terms of transmission. I mean, we know from the work we've done, you know, standard dogs, if they're not on antibiotic treatment, you know, the prevalence of important resistance mechanisms that may cause issues in a patient in a clinic are not very common. However, we know that certain activities, you know, if dogs are on antibiotics, if dogs are exposed to farm animals, we know our dogs have disgusting habits of eating the feces of other animals. I know my dogs do. Increase that risk. And then the other thing, what we're working on at the moment, is dogs being fed raw meat diets. Obviously, you know, meat is a vehicle for transmission of not just pathogens that cause diarrheal disease, but also AMR. And we obviously cook our meat. We try and deal with it hygienically in the kitchen. And I guess this, you know, sort of increase in interest from pet owners and them wanting to do the best for their animals, you know, they're exposing their animals to more potentially AMR bacteria. than animals who'd be on a sort of cooked diet. And we know that's a big risk factor from essentially people handling the diets. And also the dogs potentially excreting those bacteria and their feces, and that opportunity for transmission as well. Yeah. So I guess, you know, the risk is not huge for your sort of standard healthy dog on a cooked meat diet, and you perhaps have an increased risk if dogs are on things like raw meat diet or exposed to certain environments. You know, if they've been in hospital themselves in a veterinary clinical environment, we know they're more likely to carry AMR bacteria in their gut, which, you know, might have some nastier resistance elements.
That description is fantastic, in that that's almost exactly word for word what I used to describe humans who carry AMR risk, in terms of, you know, if you're healthy and you don't have any underlying and you're not going on to have chemotherapy rather than kind of raw meat diets, then most of the time you'd never know. And so you have to put that into some form of risk assessment, and the risk assessment is, for most of us, it's not going to cause us a problem. It's when you go into a circumstance where you've got that breach of skin or boundary for where the bacteria get to somewhere where they shouldn't be, or the fact that you become immunosuppressed because you've got something else going on. It's like so many things in life, it's all context specific. And so it shouldn't be driven by fear.
No.
I think that's a really important point to make, because I liked what Nicola said, and you've supported, Elaine, about the whole aspect of risk, of relative risk. It's not a case of if you do this, this will happen. It's a case of if this happens, something may happen, and it may increase the possibility of that happening. And I think that's a difficult message to get across at the best of times, but I think we might actually have a slight advantage here. I think the pandemic might have given us a slight advantage, in as much as the public are now understanding that the term relative risk and the meaning of relative risk has been used a lot more in the last 14 or so 18 months. And I think people are starting to understand that. So it's not a case of if you go out and do a certain thing, you will definitely get a certain disease. It might be that you're putting yourself at greater risk. And also on top of that, we've been talking a lot about infection control in the last year from a different organism's perspective. Maybe we can get people to realize that exact same level of infection control type things, you know, increasing washing your hands, etc., can really feed through into helping us control antibiotic resistant organisms. So maybe the lessons we've learned in one area can be transferred over to another. And I think that'd be interesting to see in the years to come, just how antibiotic resistance has either increased or decreased as a result of the pandemic we've just been through. Or are going
I think it's a really interesting time from kind of topical stuff, is that I kind of feel like AMR is a little bit like climate change.
Yeah, definitely.
As an individual, you won't necessarily see the impact that you as a single person make by not necessarily going to your GP and demanding antibiotics for the fact that you've got a 3-day-old cold, or not buying antibiotic treated meat that's imported from a country with a high prevalence. You know, you won't necessarily see that as you as an individual. However, collectively, we all kind of do a little bit. That's where our impact is. And that's always been a hard message to get across. But I think because it's a message that's being put across for other things now, hopefully people will understand it a little bit more and want to buy into what it means.
Yeah, I was going to say there's similarities, isn't there, when you think about vaccination and, you know, something with COVID, you're not necessarily always thinking about the vaccine in terms of your own personal risk or context. It's also about protecting other people in your community who are more vulnerable. And yeah, I think that whole thing with, you know, people going to the GP and expecting antibiotics or taking their children, I mean, that carries over into vets, people taking their animals and wanting a treatment, wanting something for the consultation, you know, and that is another issue where, similar to doctors, vets can feel, I guess, under quite a bit of pressure really to provide antibiotics.
Yeah.
Because especially with babies and animals where they can't really communicate what's going on, it's understandable that people who are carers in that situation want to feel like they've done something, because that's quite a big psychological thing. that make you feel like you're more safe and that you're more comfortable in the decision making process that you've had. And so trying to get people to understand that sometimes doing nothing is a better decision. It's quite a hard thing psychologically to support people in doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really important. Another thing that I think is, if going back a little bit, something you were saying, Elaine, about antibiotic treated meat, and I think that's a really interesting area, because there's a lot of people who have said to me, oh, I've stopped eating meat because there's antibiotics in it. Well, in this country, there isn't. We don't have antibiotic in meat. We might have an animal that has been treated with an antibiotic, but that's
a very different thing.
Very different thing. And I think there's one thing that some of the marketing you see around some meat products saying this meat is antibiotic free. Well, it always is. One of the things that I have a discussion with people, and you can see them realizing it, and they say, well, what about antibiotics in milk? And I said, well, there aren't any antibiotics in milk. Yes, there are. I said, well, how does it go off then? And it's the bacteria that grow in the milk that turn the milk. If it got a lot of antibiotics in it, it's unlikely to go off.
But it is a key thing, isn't it, though, when we're talking about the fact that we're changing our boundaries and our importing about where we get our food from, because we do have those regulations here. When
that's what I'm coming on to, because I think it's really important that, you know, we need to think about animals not as food production units, but as entities, sentient entities. And I've had people say to me, well, you know, no farmer should treat their animals with antibiotics because they shouldn't get ill. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And this person said to me, well, if their husbandry is good, an animal won't get ill. So I said, have you got children? And this person said, yes. Have you ever given them antibiotics? And they hesitated and said, yes, but you're twisting my words. Well, no, it's exactly the same. Sometimes animals and humans get unwell, not because anyone's done anything wrong. It's just, for the want of a phrase, pure bad luck. With a human, we don't even think about it. We treat them. Why would we do anything different with an animal? And yes, how we deal with that animal afterwards in terms of their meat or milk or whatever other products come off that animal needs to be considered before it goes in the food chain, if it goes in the food chain, to make sure that there's no antibiotic residues there. But we have a moral obligation to look after their animals and treat them. And agencies such as RUMA, the Responsible Uses for Medicines in Agriculture, will clearly state that we should use as little as possible, as often as is necessary. And that's under clinical guidance. We need to make sure that any animal, be it a cat or a dog or a fish or a bull, whatever it is, you know, it needs to be treated and made sure it's healthy if it is unwell.
Well, then there's a big difference, isn't there, between clinical treatment and use as a growth promoter in order to get a larger yield. And I think it's very much explain to people the difference between the two. There's a difference between using antibiotics in order to kind of get a larger yield of meat at the end of your
well, that's where husbandry comes in. I mean, do you want to take that one, Nicola, or do you want me to do it?
I was going to say, well, and that is something we've had banned in the EU, I think, for getting on for 15 years now. So, and I guess some of the fears our farmers have is that we have pretty good welfare standards, pretty high welfare standards compared to many countries. And, you know, we've made great strides in reducing antibiotic use in livestock. You know, so I guess the fear for our farmers is that you mentioned trade and meat coming in from elsewhere, and you know, that whole competition element where you might get, you know, sort of meat coming from animals with lower welfare standards, with greater use of antibiotics, and how that affects our farmers and them being able to produce meat in the way that they do to the same standards. And also, you know, carrying on with the really good work that farmers have been doing, and, you know, vet in terms of trying to drive down antibiotic use in livestock production.
Yeah, and that's been absolutely fantastic. I mean, the work I've seen RUMA doing and alongside the farmers to help manifest that change has been extraordinary. I mean, Lord O'Neill in his 2016 report put a target by 2018, I think it had to be 50 milligrams per kilogram or below, and the farming industry beat that by, I think, about a year, and got it lower than that, and that's fantastic. And the therapeutic, the use of antibiotics that we're talking about now is therapeutic, not not growth promoting, and that hasn't, as Nicola says, since 2006 at least, that's been banned in the UK and the EU, and I would massively applaud its continued ban. I don't think that should change at all, because that is an example of how, if you have good husbandry and good practices, you get an animal to grow at a good rate, at a meat worthy rate, or a milk yielding rate, without the use of antimicrobials. And we need to protect those antimicrobials for use when we, either as a vet or as a clinician, a human clinician as it were, we have the drugs that can treat us, and we eliminate, or we never eliminate, but we minimize the sorts of scenarios we saw in that video.
So as a consumer, because obviously this is not my area of expertise, and I think a lot of people watching it probably won't be theirs either, is there something that about labeling that's more specific that you think is useful to actually support that consumer selection, in terms of, is it like Buy British? I don't know, what is it that people as individuals in terms of their actions could potentially take?
Well, I was going to say, well, Red Tractor is an assurance scheme that is quite strict on antibiotic use, in, you know, working with farmers who have that, you know, accredited to Red Tractor. So the Red Tractor usually, I think, is a good mark of that higher welfare and that strive to, you know, basically have good antimicrobial stewardship in production.
Yeah.
So that's one,
yeah.
You know, British Red Tractor is certainly one aspect I'd go for.
Yeah. And I wouldn't want to sound too jingoistic, but I think also at the moment buying British as well, because we do have good standards, and you know, the producers that purchase the animals that then go into the food chain are stringent. None of them want to have a situation where it's established that there is a problem in that production line. So it's that there is very high standards, and they are adhered to. But as Nicola quite rightly says, the Red Tractor is probably one of the most established mechanisms. And don't be fooled by the antibiotic free, because all the meat on your market shelves is antibiotic free, because there are withdrawal periods. If an animal has become unwell, does need to be treated, there is a withdrawal period for those meat or those animal products before it can go on sale, if indeed a vet says it can go on sale.
Is that true though elsewhere? So like, as I said, when I was in the States, I know they use an awful lot of antibiotics still as growth promoters. So obviously, as this is digital, it might be seen by people outside of the UK. How widespread is that in terms of, if someone was using something as a growth promoter, do they still withhold it for a certain amount of time to stop residual antibiotics going into the food chain, or is that just not something that they consider?
I think it would depend, wouldn't it, Mark, really, on the country, because many of the countries will still have withdrawal periods, but it obviously depends on the drug, the animal product, and whether there's likely to be residues in it. But you know, most global north sort of countries, I'd say, would have withdrawal periods still. But I guess it's that sort of, I guess, trying to think what you're trying to do with withdrawal periods, because withdrawal periods, we're trying to make sure antibiotics and other animal medicines don't end up in the food chain, and have that obviously selection in people's guts if they have resistant bacteria there, which it may increase, but it doesn't necessarily mean it stops resistance being transferred by the food product. So I guess it's also separating the two things out, that you stop the antibiotic, but you still have that selection of those types of resistant bacteria on the meat product, which then goes into the food chain for consumption.
I think that's a really important message that I think people don't necessarily understand, that actually you have the antibiotic itself, but then you have the other things that are associated that may already have become resistant, that may not be dealt with in the same way.
Yeah, no, it's a complicated one. And also back to the subject of growth promotion, I think there are certain countries in the world where there has been, until fairly recently, quite reasonable levels of use of antibiotics as growth promoters in some of the countries that you've mentioned, but they are now working towards minimizing that. There is a big push in the States, for instance, to minimize growth promotion, because there is the realization that the antibiotic resistance wave or tsunami, as I've seen it reported, is something that needs to be halted, because one of the, Nicola's absolutely correct in the fact that stopping the antibiotic doesn't mean you've necessarily stopped the antibiotic resistant organism moving through. But if you are using less antibiotics in the first place, you are starting to limit the chance, not remove it, but limit the chance of an organism mutating and becoming resistant in the first place, which will have an add-on effect to what Nicola's saying. So there's benefits all around to making sure we have judicious use of antibiotics, whether we're a vet or whether we're a medical doctor.
Well, I think,
sorry, I was just going to say that I suppose that's why global approaches are needed, right?
Absolutely.
That's exactly what I was going to mention. Sorry.
Yeah.
I was going to say, and it is such a global problem because, I think COVID, if it's taught us anything, is that things spread. An issue can start off, in a geographic area and quickly become, an issue worldwide. And, people go to countries, the food in those countries, they may go into hospital in those countries. So, whatever AMR issues there might be in some countries who have perhaps less control on how, antibiotics and use in animals or people, that doesn't necessarily stay within that country because people, travel, food travels.
Yeah.
So it's definitely a global issue. And I think, that is accepted as well in terms of, the amount of work that the UK researchers are doing with researchers overseas and collaborating with different countries in terms of, taking that sort of global and also One Health approach to tackling the issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree. I had a really interesting conversation with someone at a public engagement event, and they were asking me why we didn't see this sort of thing 100 years ago or 50 years ago so much, but definitely 100 years ago. And I said, well, there's some obvious things there. One is we didn't necessarily have many of the antibiotics 100 years ago that we've got now. But equally so, travel was different 100 years ago to what it is now. We in a matter of hours can travel from literally one side of the globe to the other, whereas 100 years ago you were probably on a boat for a couple of months, and if you had a certain disease, you may not have ended your journey. So the potential infection risk didn't necessarily get to your absolute destination. So a lot about human behaviour has changed, and the way, as you say, we are much more global now. So we've got to take that into consideration when we're moving around. We're not just moving our bodies around, we're moving our virome, we're moving our microbiome, and we're moving our resistome around as well. So we've got to be careful of that.
And also, people didn't used to survive from other conditions. If you had a stroke, if you had a heart attack, if you had cancer, your long-term outcomes didn't mean that you kind of continue to live with a chronic condition. That was it. Your time was up. Now we're living in a revolutionary time in terms of healthcare with some of the amazing stuff that people can do. But that does mean that as we manage to deal with chronic conditions and enable people to live for decades past the point that they might have done even 10 years ago, that means that we also have a larger and larger susceptible population where they may visit healthcare more often, they're suddenly in touch with their GPs more often, and therefore something like this is something that has a greater chance of impacting them. And if you acquire a resistant organism, you don't necessarily just get rid of it. Yeah. So we've got lots of studies that say if you acquire an antibiotic resistant organism, I have we've got kids who like 12, 14, 15 years out, when I handed them over to adult care, still carried it. And so you're having something that's impacting you long term in terms of what's going on. And for us with kids with antibiotic resistant organisms, you get things like phone calls from schools saying, are they allowed to come to school with MRSA? Of course they're allowed to come to school with MRSA. There will be other children who've gone and hugged their grandparent in a care home who have MRSA, and you never know. And they'll pick it up for maybe a few days, a few months, and leave it. It's not going to be a risk. It's the organism plus the situation plus the susceptibility, that is where your risk lies. It's not any individual one of those things.
Yeah, that's a good point. Do we see the same sort of thing with that in the animal world, Nicola, or do we not know?
In terms of
Carrying chronic carriage of an antibiotic?
we do. I mean, it obviously depends on the organism and the location. I mean, we know the animal, well, the dog equivalent of MRSA would be MRSP. So we have animals who are colonized with MRSP for 18 months. We, of course, have animals that get colonized with MRSA, often by, you know, pets from the same strains that we see causing infections in hospital in people. I think in terms of more bacteria in the gut, I think that perhaps a little bit more turnover. And I think there's less studies really longitudinally showing the, you know, sort of persistent carriage of particular strains, but definitely for similar to MRSA, we do see that.
It's fascinating. We could talk about this for hours.
I think that's one of the problems with a lot of the studies we do is, you know, we tend to do sort of cross-sectional studies where we take a one-off sample and you get that snapshot at that time. It's obviously a lot more time consuming to do those longitudinal samplings where you follow people and animals over long term. It's, yeah, you're still only getting that sort of snapshot. It'd be nice if we could follow continuously and get the full picture, which would tell us a bit more about transmission and what happens.
Maybe we should start making PhDs in your lab 6 or 7 years rather than 3 or 4.
Don't do that to the poor students. They don't need 7 years for a PhD.
Get some good information though.
We would. I was
going to say, if I could pass one message to the public is if you get asked to take part in studies, please provide fecal samples, because I know whenever we want to do studies and we want to look at that, you know, the human animal interface, we can always get samples of feces off animals, but trying to get them off people is always like trying to get blood out of a stone.
Yeah.
Dr. Jane Freeman, who's doing one of our other panels, has a brilliant thing for this. So she studies C. diff. And she says, if I ask a young person, they're never prepared to give me a stool sample. She's like, if I ask my older constituents, they're always happy. They're like, yeah, whatever. Yeah. I suppose you've been there and seen it and done it, and people are just much more prepared to see the value in what you're doing because of the fact that, you know, when I was in my 20s, if you'd asked me for a stool sample, I would have run for the hills, to be honest.
Yeah.
There is always a problem, and then, you know, when you want to do, you know, sort of big studies to look at these issues, it was really hard to get people to part with their poo. And a lot of the time, we only want a very small amount. We don't want the full.
Pot.
Yeah. People think of it as unclean. It's quite hard, isn't it?
It is interesting, really. I think people would much prefer to give blood than give poo.
Yeah.
So that would be my plea to the public. Please part with your poo if you're asked to.
But in a responsible manner.
In a responsible manner, yeah. Definitely in a responsible manner. And when asked to give it for a scientific study.
Yeah. Or actually just being prepared to, you know, I think research is really important to everybody, and that's a message we need to get out, because you may not need it right now, but you may need it in 20 years' time. And so encouraging people when they're asked to partake in any form of research.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah.
To understand the value of it and why we're asking you to do it, and to please step forward and be counted, I think is really important.
And it is only counted. You know, no one's going to come back to you and point a finger and say your sample said this. And you know, I've had patients in the past say to me, well, what's the point of me doing it if you can't tell me about me? And I'm, you know, it's a bit like I think you both said earlier on. It's about the greater good.
Yeah.
And you know, we need to understand various different diseases, including AMR, more than we currently do. We know a lot, but we don't know yet enough. And garnering that information from patient samples, from the brilliant patients that come forward and offer themselves to help us is we can't thank them enough. It is vital to what we do, and it is vital for us getting answers going forward for various different diseases, ranging from cancer, diabetes, through to infectious disease. Everything. We need your we need your bodily parts, folks.
And not in a way that will hurt you.
It out loud, but
not in a way that will hurt you. It's
not in a way that will hurt you. No, absolutely not.
And I think the other thing is that antimicrobial resistance is constantly changing. Bacteria is super clever. And, you know, every generation of them happens in a fraction of the time of a generation of us in terms of humanity. And so even those things that I feel like we have a feel for right now are going to be different in 10 years. And
I had a really interesting interview with a television journalist who said to me, so when we get another antibiotic, it'll all be over, right? And it's very difficult in the time you've got on a television interview to explain, no, that's not that. This is a continual process, because every time you change the drug, the organism changes its resistance, and that can carry on and on and on over time, and become problematic again. So I tell my undergraduates, it was very interesting. When I was an undergraduate, one of my professors said to me, I don't know why you've gone into microbiology. The future's biochemistry. Microbiology is a dead subject. Now, I can say to my students, if you're a microbiologist, you will always have a job. Because infection, you know, will carry on, unfortunately, but it will. Resistance is an ongoing battle. We are not going to solve this overnight. And there are emerging diseases, as the last 14 months has told us. So we have work to do, and this is ongoing. So any of you out there who are budding scientists, join us.
It's the best job in the world.
Do, you know.
But it's also not all doom and gloom, right? As we've talked
not,
about, you know, there are individual things we can do. The risk to us as individuals is low, but it requires us to all come together to really think about what we might do differently in order to make sure that that one susceptible person doesn't get impacted by this in the way that we've seen in that film. Because we don't want that. We want people to not have those impacts on their lives that affect their entire families.
And I think we've seen that in the things we've been discussing today. I mean, the fall in use of antimicrobials in agriculture has been phenomenal, and you know, it's to be applauded. But because it's a good news story, it doesn't really get out there.
Yeah, that's very true.
And that's a shame, because you know, there's a lot of people on farms and in veterinary schools and also in medical schools who've worked really hard to make things functional and facilitate this fall in use. And it has not been a fall in use that has been related to a fall in welfare. Quite the opposite, in fact. Welfare's gone up. So that is a really good news story. And the fact that science can react. Science does react. Look at the last 18 months. You know, we've gone from, wow, what is this thing? Where's it come from? To here's a vaccine. And we've got a nice, safe, efficacious vaccine from various different sources that is working really well, and it's helping us get through the pandemic, along with all the infection control, along with all the changes in our behaviours. But it's positive, and we can do something very similar with antibiotic resistance. So let's see if we can now think about, can we possibly perhaps utilise something like vaccine technology in certain bacterial diseases. It's done in the animal industry quite a lot. Why can't we translate that over into humans and see if we can protect ourselves from getting infected, as opposed to dealing with the infection once we've got it? That's going to take some time, but I think it's something we need to think about.
And also that behaviour piece, I think we have seen how important behaviour is. And from my personal point of view, it's actually been fairly easy for people to step back for the last kind of 10 years, 15 years to go. Science will solve this. So science can solve a lot of things, but actually our behaviour isn't completely separate to science. Those two things overlap, and we have to think about how we do that education piece, how we all act as individuals, and what our behaviour is like across those boundaries in order to really impact this. You know, how do we deal with outbreaks in other countries? How do we deal with migrant health? How do we support that global infection picture in order to make sure that we're doing all the right things? Because it's no point in us kind of going, oh great, in healthcare I have wonderful antibiotics in this country, and completely forgetting that there's large parts of the world that don't have great access to antibiotics, and therefore may be forced to use them inappropriately because it's all they've got. We have to stop seeing this as them and us and start seeing us all working together on this one.
I think that's absolutely right. I was at a conference in the year 2000, 1999, in fact, it was 1999, and we was talking about food, global food health and antibiotic resistance. And a gentleman got up, who was one of the international delegates, and said, "You are all talking about meat and how important it is to have healthy meat. You're right, but most of the world can't afford meat. They're looking forward to having clean and healthy water." And it silenced the room, because yes, sometimes it's as basic as that. The water you drink not having organisms in it, which may or may not, but certain have antibiotic resistance, but certainly are capable of causing disease. So you're right, this is a global thing and a global push. And one thing Lord O'Neill said in his report was that we can't look at this as a one country issue. It's a global issue, and it needs to be looked at both from the veterinary standpoint and the human standpoint. And I know there are a lot of projects going on with various different countries around the world. Some people here are involved with those, looking at antibiotic resistance in various different parts of the world, partnering with places like the UK and some of the some other countries around the world to try and have that impact, because it's absolutely critical. So in the last couple of minutes, is there anything that either of you guys want to finish on as a leaving statement, a mic drop statement? So I don't know which one to pick on first. Nicola, you made a noise, it's you.
I'm trying to think, have I got a mic drop statement? Yeah, I guess it just, I guess it comes back to, that what we said, that everybody can make a difference. But people thinking about how they access and use antibiotics, whether it's for themselves, their loved ones, or their animals.
Yeah.
And then, thinking, I guess, about where your meat comes from as well. In terms of, we all have to do our bit to, I think, as Elaine said, with the similarities of climate change, we all do our little bit to help the situation. So that's all I'd say, is people to think about antibiotic use. Do they really need to take antibiotics? And of course, making sure that if you have antibiotics left over, which sometimes we do for people, sometimes we do for animals, is obviously not using them.
Yeah, take them back to the pharmacy.
Making sure you're not using them willy-nilly. So it's which is going to cause problem. Yeah, finish your course. You got any left over, do not be tempted to use. So I've got a bit of a sore throat, or my animal's got a bit of diarrhea, I'll give them a few antibiotic tablets.
Yeah, please don't.
Yeah.
And as Elaine said, I think it was a dropped in comment, but I think it's a really important one. When you're given a course of antibiotics, there is a medical reason why it is a course.
Yeah.
And I know sometimes halfway through you think, "Oh, I feel better now, it's fine." There is a reason. Some of those organisms are now at a lower level than they would be to give you disease, but they're still there. So if you can take the rest of the course, the pharmacologists have looked at this, and they understand why they've given you a 7, 8, 10 day, whatever time course it is. Please take those antibiotics, because it will stop the little blighters coming back, hopefully, and causing you another problem. So Elaine, to finish, have you got a mic drop comment?
Nicola took the wonderful one. So Nicola's so right, and you have been so right all along. I think the main thing I want people to take away from this isn't scaremongering, right? We're not trying to say live in fear, oh my God, like doom, gloom, disaster. What we are trying to say is that this is something we need to think about, and that we can all do something about it. So don't be scared into doing nothing, but take baby steps into thinking what you can do. Do you need to go and get antibiotics for that ear infection? And if you are asked to do something in a healthcare setting, be that take the full course of antibiotics, be that stay in your room because of the fact that you may be a risk to other people, even though it's not causing you any harm, please know that we're doing it for the best reasons possible, and comply.
So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much to my lovely colleagues, Professor Nicola Williams and Dr. Elaine Cloutman-Green. It's been wonderful to be with you. And just the final mic drop comment, being that both of you have said it, and a certain supermarket also uses it, every little bit counts. So everything you can do, folks, is going to be a benefit. Thank you. I hope you enjoy the rest of the festival.